The ship was cold, and it smelled like nothing Ethan Mercer had ever encountered before. A sharp chemical burn mixed with something sweet and rotten that clung to the back of his throat like a warning. He had been unconscious when they took him, and he only knew this because the last thing he remembered was the bridge of his patrol corvette, the Steadfast, lighting up with proximity alarms, and then a flash of blue-white light that swallowed everything whole. Now he was here, wherever here was. He sat on a smooth floor that felt like glass, but was not glass, because it pulsed faintly beneath his palms, with a rhythm that reminded him of a heartbeat, slow and deliberate, and deeply unsettling, because floors were not supposed to have heartbeats. The room around him was a perfect cube, roughly 4 meters on each side, with walls that shifted between pale silver and soft white, depending on how the light caught them, and the light itself had no visible source, because it seemed to come from everywhere at once, gentle and even and without shadow. There was no door that he could see. He had already checked. He stood and rolled his shoulders and felt the bruise along his ribs, where something had hit him during the capture. Not hard enough to break bone, but hard enough to let him know that whoever had taken him could have broken every bone in his body if they had wanted to. That told him something important. They wanted him alive and mostly intact, and that meant they wanted something from him. And as long as they wanted something, he had leverage, however small. He pressed his hand flat against the wall, and it was warm, almost body temperature, and he felt that same faint pulse beneath the surface, and he pulled his hand back and wiped it on his trousers, because touching it felt too much like touching skin. A sound came from above, a series of clicks and hums that rose and fell in patterns too complex to be random, but too alien to be language, at least not any language his translator implant could parse. Then a section of the wall simply vanished. It did not slide open or fold away or dissolve. It was there, and then it was not there. And standing in the space where it had been were 3 creatures that Ethan had never seen before in his life, and he had seen a lot of strange things in his years on the frontier. The first was tall, nearly 3 meters, with a body like a mantis, built from obsidian, all sharp angles and segmented limbs that clicked softly against the floor as it moved, and its head was a narrow wedge with 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern, each one a deep amber that caught the light and held it. Vreth, his mind supplied from half-remembered briefings about species the frontier scouts had catalogued but never made contact with. The second was shorter and broader, and looked like a person-shaped crystal formation, pale blue and translucent. Light moving inside its body, in slow spirals. And it had no face that Ethan could identify, but it oriented itself toward him, in a way that made it clear it was watching. Sonari, he guessed, though he was less sure about this one. The third was the worst. It was a mass of pale green gelatin, roughly the size of a large dog, shapeless and shifting, and it moved by flowing across the floor like a slow wave. And within its translucent body, Ethan could see darker shapes that might have been organs, or might have been something else entirely, and every few seconds the entire mass would shudder slightly, as if it were thinking. He did not know what that one was. The tall one, the Vreth, stepped forward and made a sound that was half click and half whistle, and Ethan felt his translator implant buzz uselessly against the bone behind his ear, trying and failing to find a pattern it could work with. The Vreth tried again, this time producing a different sequence of sounds, and then another, and another, cycling through what Ethan realized were different languages, none of which his implant could grab onto. Then it spoke in something that was almost English, broken and strange, and clearly learned from intercepted transmissions rather than conversation. "You are the human," it said, and it was not a question. "Captain Ethan Mercer," he replied, keeping his voice steady and calm, because showing fear to an unknown species was never a good first move. United Human Territories Naval Corps, serial number 772-. Not relevant, the Vreth interrupted, and its 4 amber eyes blinked in sequence from top to bottom. You are specimen, not soldier here. Your designations do not apply. Ethan felt something cold settle in his chest at the word specimen, but he kept his face neutral and said nothing. The Vreth turned to the crystalline sonari and produced a rapid series of clicks that were clearly not meant for Ethan. Ethan to understand, and the sonari pulsed with light in response. And then both of them looked at him with what he could only describe as professional interest. The kind of look a butcher gives a carcass. They came into the room, and they brought tools. The tools were not sharp, and they were not cruel, but they were thorough. Small devices that pressed against his skin and hummed. Thin needles that drew blood with a precision that he barely felt. Soft pads that were placed against his chest and his temples and the inside of his wrists. They took blood from 4 different sites. They scraped cells from inside his cheek. They plucked hair from his head and his arm with a careful deliberateness that suggested they understood the difference between the two. They pressed a device against the bruise on his ribs, and it made a sound like a camera shutter, and he assumed they had just imaged his bones. Through all of it, Ethan sat still and cooperated. Resistance at this point would be stupid, and because every second they spent studying him was a second he spent studying them. He watched how the Vreth moved, precise and mechanical, every gesture calculated and efficient. No wasted motion, like a surgeon or a sniper. He watched how the sonari communicated, through pulses of light that traveled through its crystalline body, in patterns he was already starting to memorize. He watched how the gelatin creature stayed near the door, and pulsed and shuddered, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that it was not just one mind in there, but many. All of them focused on him. When they were done, the Vreth held up a small transparent container filled with his blood. Dark red and human and ordinary, and it looked at the container, and then at him, with an expression that he could not read on a face that was never designed to be read by human eyes. "What are you hoping to find?" Ethan asked. The Vreth considered him for a moment. "Everything," it said. They left, and the wall reappeared behind them as if it had never been gone, and Ethan was alone again in the warm, pulsing cube, with nothing but the ache in his ribs and the small sting of needle marks on his arms. He sat down on the floor and leaned back against the wall, and he smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who knew something that the people studying him did not. The smile of someone who had read enough history to know exactly what happened when you put human blood under a microscope and expected it to behave. They would learn. They always learned. Somewhere on the other side of that wall, senior taxonomist Uralvan placed the samples into the automated analysis system and assigned them standard classification protocols, and moved on to her other duties, because this was routine. This was just another species. This was just another set of biological data to be catalogued. She did not check the monitors again for another 2 hours. When she did, she stopped walking and stared and felt something she had not felt in over 200 years of scientific work. She felt confused. One of the human cell cultures was moving, not drifting the way dead cells drift in solution, but moving with direction and purpose, pushing against the edges of its container, like a living thing trying to find a way out. She tapped the monitor and ran a diagnostic, and the instruments reported that everything was functioning normally. She dismissed it, and made a note in the log and walked away. That was her first mistake. 6 hours after the samples were taken, the first alarm went off in Laboratory 7 of the research vessel Athenaeum, and it was not a loud alarm, because loud alarms were for fires and hull breaches and imminent death. This was a soft chime that meant something unexpected had happened in one of the bioanalysis chambers. Junior researcher Kveth of the Sonari heard it first, because the Sonari did not hear with ears, but with their entire crystalline bodies, and they could feel vibrations that other species could not even detect. Kveth moved to the monitoring station and looked at the data feed from Chamber 14, where a sample of the human's white blood cells had been placed alongside a control culture of Vreth epithelial cells for standard cross-species comparison. The Vreth cells were dead, all of them. This was not supposed to happen, because the two cultures had been placed in separate wells within the same dish, with a nutrient barrier between them that should have prevented any interaction at all, and the Vreth cells had been healthy and thriving when the experiment began. Kveth ran the imaging sequence, and what appeared on the screen made the light inside their body pulse rapidly with alarm. The human white blood cells had breached the nutrient barrier, not by dissolving it or breaking through it, but by growing over it, forming a thin bridge of living tissue that spanned the gap between the two wells. And once they reached the other side, they had done something that Kveth had never seen immune cells do outside of a living body. They had attacked. Not randomly and not clumsily, but with what looked horrifyingly like coordination, surrounding the Vreth cells in clusters and breaking them apart and absorbing their contents, and the white blood cells that had fed were now larger and more active than the ones that had not, as if the consumption had made them stronger. Kveth called for Yerel Von. Senior taxonomist arrived 17 minutes later, and by then the situation had gotten worse, because it was not just Chamber 14 anymore. Chamber 9 held human skin cells alongside Oluth membrane samples, and the skin cells had formed a dense mat across the bottom of the dish. The Oluth membrane was gone, not dead, but dissolved, broken down into raw materials that the human cells were using to grow. Chamber 22 held human saliva samples next to Sonari crystal fragments, and the saliva had etched visible marks into the crystal surface, something that should have been chemically impossible given what they knew about the pH levels involved. Every single chamber that contained human biological material alongside alien biological material told the same story. The human cells won. Every time, without exception, regardless of what they were placed against, the human cells identified the alien material as either a threat or a resource, responded accordingly, and they did not stop until the alien material was consumed or destroyed. Yerel Von stood in the middle of the laboratory and felt her 4 eyes blink in rapid sequence, which was a Vreth stress response she had not experienced since her first year of training. Contamination, she said, because that was the logical explanation. There must be a contaminant in the cultures, accelerating cellular activity. Re-sterilize all chambers and prepare fresh samples. They did. They re-sterilized everything with protocols designed to eliminate every possible variable. Protocols that had been refined over thousands of years by the most advanced civilization in the known galaxy. And they drew new samples from the human and ran the experiments again from the beginning. The results were identical. But it was what happened next that truly frightened them. A technician, a young Vreth named Drawl, who was running out of alien samples to test against, made a decision that would change everything. A decision born from scientific curiosity and the kind of what-if thinking that drives discovery and occasionally drives horror. Drawl took 2 separate human tissue samples, one from the blood draw and one from the cheek swab, and placed them in the same dish with no alien material present. Just human cells next to human cells. Within 90 minutes, the 2 cultures had made contact, and within 120 minutes, one of them was dead. The blood cells had identified the cheek cells as other, as not self, as competition, and they had attacked with the same brutal efficiency they had shown against the alien samples, surrounding and consuming and growing stronger from what they took. Drawl called Kveth, and Kveth called Yerel Von, and the 3 of them stood around the monitor and watched the replay in silence. They fight everything, Drawl said, and his voice was very quiet. Yes, Kveth agreed. Including themselves, Drawl continued. Yes, Kveth agreed again. Yerelvan said nothing for a long time, and when she finally spoke, her voice had the careful, measured tone of someone who is trying very hard not to be afraid. This is what an apex predator's biology looks like, she said. Not at the scale we usually observe it, not teeth and claws and speed, but at the most fundamental level of cellular behavior. Every single cell in this creature's body is programmed to compete and consume and dominate. And it is only the architecture of the whole organism that keeps these cells from destroying each other. The body is a cage, Kveth said softly, and the light inside their crystalline form dimmed, as if the thought itself had cost them something. The body is a battlefield, Yerelvan corrected, and the war never stops, not even for a moment. The cells fight, and the body mediates, and the organism survives, not because it is at peace. It has achieved a balance of violence so precise that it mimics peace. She turned to look at the cell where the human was being held, 3 floors above them. And even though she could not see him through the layers of metal and composite, she felt his presence like a weight. "What is he doing?" she asked. Drawl checked the monitoring feed from the containment cell. "Sleeping," he said. "Sleeping," Yerelvan repeated, and she found this somehow the most disturbing detail of all, because inside that sleeping body, trillions of cells were fighting a war that never ended, and the creature that housed them could close its eyes and rest, as if the violence within was as natural as breathing. Because for him, it was. They continued working through the night cycle, and the results continued to mount. And every new data point told the same story, and the story was this: human biology was not designed for coexistence. It was designed for conquest. At every level, every cell, encoded into the very structure of its genetic material, like a battle plan written in molecules. At hour 9, they fed the human. Ethan took the tray of nutrient paste that was pushed through a slot in the wall, and he ate it without complaint, even though it tasted like wet cardboard mixed with something vaguely metallic. And he looked up at the monitoring device in the corner of his cell, a small, dark lens that he had identified within his first hour of captivity. "Have you figured it out yet?" he said to the lens, and his tone was conversational and almost friendly. In the laboratory below, Yerelvan heard him speak, and she did not answer, and she told herself it was because responding to a specimen was unprofessional. But the truth was simpler than that. She did not know what to say to something whose blood was a weapon. At hour 11, the containment alarm for Chamber 9 activated, and this alarm was not a soft chime, but a sharp, urgent tone. That meant biological breach, and when Drawl ran to check, he found that the human cell culture had outgrown its dish. Not by a little. The cells had formed a thin film of living tissue that crawled over the rim of the petri dish and spread across the countertop in a slow expanding circle. And every alien sample within 15 centimeters of that circle was dead. Not dying, but dead, reduced to inert organic matter that the human biofilm was already beginning to absorb. Drawl sealed the counter in an emergency containment field, and stood there breathing hard, and staring at the thin glistening layer of human cells that pressed against the field barrier, and seemed almost to test it, pushing here and there, with a patience that was far more frightening than speed. He called Yerelvan. She came and she looked, and she stood in silence for a very long time. Then she walked to her station, and opened a priority communication channel to the Concord High Council, began to type a message that she never thought she would have to write. The message was simple. Request immediate council review of species 7918C. Classification insufficient. Current containment protocols may be inadequate. Recommend highest priority response. She sent it, and then she looked up at the ceiling in the direction of the cell where the human was being kept. And for the first time in her 400 years of life, She understood what it felt like to be prey. The Athenaeum went into full biological lockdown 12 hours after the first samples were taken, and the process was swift and thorough, because the Concorde had protocols for everything, and lockdown meant sealed ventilation, and ultraviolet sterilization of all corridors, and the deployment of automated containment drones that floated through the hallways, scanning for any trace of biological material that was not where it was supposed to be. Yerelvan supervised the lockdown personally, and she had not slept, and she was not going to sleep, because every time she closed her eyes, she saw that thin film of human cells pressing against the containment field, with a patience that made her mandibles click with anxiety. The response from the Concorde High Council arrived within 3 hours of her message, which was extraordinarily fast, given that council communications normally took days to process through the bureaucratic layers that separated a research vessel from the body of man. Governing body of 1,000 worlds. They were sending an arbiter, not a committee, and not a review board, and not a diplomatic liaison, but an arbiter, one of the Aluth hive minds that served as the council's direct representatives, beings with the authority to make decisions that could reshape the political landscape of entire sectors. The fact that they were sending one here for a single biological specimen told Yerelvan everything she needed to know about how seriously the council was taking this. While they waited for the arbiter to arrive, Yerelvan did what she always did when faced with something she did not understand. She studied it. She and her team ran every analysis they could think of on the human biological data they had collected, and what they found over the next several hours was not just alarming, but fundamentally destabilizing to their understanding of what biology could be. Itself. They had mapped it expecting to find the usual architecture of a sentient species, regulatory genes and developmental sequences, and the normal machinery of cellular life. And they found all of that, but they also found something else. Vast stretches of genetic code that had been shaped not by passive evolution, but by active warfare. Millions of years of competition on what their database classified as a Category 9 death world had produced a genome that did not merely encode instructions for building an organism. It encoded instructions for building a survivor, a competitor, a conqueror. Every gene carried the scars of ancient battles, viral DNA spliced into the human code by infections that had happened millions of years ago, parasitic sequences that the human genome had not just defeated, but captured and repurposed, turning the weapons of its enemies into tools for its own survival. The human genome was not a blueprint, it was a war trophy. Cabinet. The second discovery was about the human immune system, and this was the one that made Kveth stop working and sit in silence for nearly an hour. Every species in the Concorde had some form of biological defense, mechanisms that identified foreign material and neutralized it. But the human immune system was not a defense mechanism in any sense that the Concorde recognized. It was a standing army. It maintained billions of specialized cells that patrolled the body constantly, searching for anything that did not belong. And when they found something, they didn't simply neutralize it. They dismantled it and studied its components, and then produced new specialized cells designed specifically to destroy that exact type of threat more efficiently next time. But that was not the part that disturbed Kveth. The part that disturbed Kveth was that the human immune system also attacked the body itself, constantly, as a form of quality control, testing its own cells for weakness and deviation, and destroying any cell that did not meet its standards. The human body was running a continuous internal war game. Its own immune system attacking its own cells to keep them sharp and compliant. And the cells that survived this constant assault were tougher and more resilient than they would have been otherwise. The third discovery was about human cancer, and this was the one that made Yerelvan feel genuinely cold for the first time since she was a larva. Cancer in humans was not a disease in the way the Concorde understood disease. It was a rebellion. Human cells were so aggressive and so driven to compete that occasionally a cell would simply refuse to follow the rules of the body anymore. It would shut off its own death programming and begin to grow and divide without restraint, hoarding resources and building its own blood supply, and essentially attempting to become an independent organism within the host, the human. Body had to maintain constant surveillance and enforcement, just to prevent its own components from going rogue. The cancer was not a flaw in the design. It was a feature breaking containment. Eurelvan sat with this information, and she tried to process it within the framework of her 4 centuries of experience, and she could not, because nothing in that experience had prepared her for the idea of a species whose own cells were so relentlessly aggressive that the organism had to wage a permanent internal war just to maintain coherence. She looked at the data on her screen, and she looked at the containment readings from the cell where the human was being held, and she realized that she was not looking at a biological specimen anymore. She was looking at a weapon that had learned to walk and talk and smile. It was at this point that Ethan Mercer spoke. Not to anyone in particular, because from his perspective, he was alone in a glass cube on an alien ship, and he had no way of knowing that his every word was being monitored and translated and analyzed. But he spoke anyway, because humans do that. They fill silence with sound, because the silence inside their own bodies is already loud enough. "I know you are watching," he said, and he said it calmly, while sitting on the floor with his back against the warm, pulsing wall. "I have been watched before, by better and by worse, and I want you to know that I understand what you are seeing in your laboratories right now, and I am not surprised, and I am not ashamed." He paused, and he looked at his own hands, turning them over and studying the lines of his palms as if seeing them for the first time. "We know what we are," he said. "We have always known, since the first time one of us looked through a microscope and saw the war happening inside our own blood. We have known what lives inside us." He closed his hands into fists and then opened them again. "About it. We have done it for thousands of years. Stories about the beast inside, the wolf beneath the skin, the darkness in the heart. We have 100 different ways of describing the thing that lives in us, and every single one of them is true." He looked up at the corner of the cell where the monitoring lens was hidden, and even though he could not actually see it, his eyes found the exact spot as if he could feel it watching him. "You think we are frightening from the outside," he said, and his voice was gentle, almost kind, like a man explaining something sad to a child. "You have no idea what it is like to live inside one of these bodies, to carry this war in your blood every single day and still choose to be kind, to feel the violence in every cell and still choose to build instead of burn, to know what you truly are at the molecular level and still choose to love." He smiled, and it was a tired smile. "That is what makes us human, not the war, In the laboratory, Eurelvan listened, and she felt something she could not name, and Kvet's light dimmed to almost nothing, and Drawl stood perfectly still, with all 4 of his eyes fixed on the monitor. The Arbiter arrived 6 hours later. Salith of the Aluth was larger than the specimen of Aluth aboard the Athenaeum, nearly twice the mass, and its body was a darker green with filaments of gold running through it that pulsed with the coordinated thoughts of the hundreds of individual minds that comprised its being. It reviewed the data in silence, absorbing it directly through a data port that interfaced with its distributed nervous system, and the review took less than 4 minutes, because when you have hundreds of minds working in parallel, even the most complex information can be processed quickly. When it was done, it turned to Eurelvan and spoke in the harmonic, multitonal voice of the Aluth, a sound like several people humming different notes at once. "This changes everything," it said. "What will the council do?" Eurelvan asked. The Arbiter did not answer immediately, and when it did, the gold filaments in its body were pulsing fast and bright. "I will send my recommendation now," it said, and it moved to the communication array, and it composed a message that was encrypted at the highest level available to the Concord government. And the message was short, because the most dangerous truths usually are. It read, "Reclassify species 7918C. Current designation insufficient. Recommended new threat level, existential. Recommend immediate council session. The galaxy has a new apex predator, and it has been hiding in plain sight." The message was sent, and in the containment cell 3 floors above, Ethan Mercer laid down on the floor and closed his eyes. And inside his body, the war continued, quiet and relentless and ancient, the war that had been fighting since the first cell divided on. A small blue world, orbiting an unremarkable star in an unfashionable arm of the galaxy. He slept, and his cells did not. The Concord High Council had not convened an emergency session in 2017 years, the last one having been called to address the collapse of the Rathani Stellar Bridge, which had killed 4 billion people across 9 systems, and reshaped the political map of the entire galactic core. The fact that a single biological specimen from an unclassified species had triggered the second emergency session in 2 millennia was not lost on anyone present. The council chamber was a vast spherical space carved into the heart of a station that orbited a pulsar, chosen for its location at the gravitational center of Concord space, and for the symbolic weight of meeting beside a dead star. A reminder that even the most powerful things in the universe eventually collapse. 12 senior representatives sat in their designated positions around the curved walls, each one a leader of their respective species. And in the center of the chamber, a holographic projection displayed the Athenaeum's data in rotating 3-dimensional models that showed human cells moving and fighting and consuming with a mechanical ruthlessness that made several representatives shift uncomfortably in their seats. Salith of the Olaf presented the findings, and it was thorough and clinical, and it did not editorialize because the data spoke loudly enough on its own. When the presentation ended, the chamber was silent for 19 seconds, which was a very long time for a room full of beings who governed 1,000 worlds. Then the arguments began. The Vreth military commander, a scarred and ancient creature named Tessark, who had personally overseen the pacification of 6 hostile species during his career, spoke first, and his position was clear from his opening words. "This species must be eliminated," he said, and his voice carried the flat certainty of someone who had made this kind of decision before and would make it again without hesitation. The biological data is unambiguous. Every cell in a human body is a weapon. Their immune system is a military force. Their very genome is a record of perpetual warfare. And this is what they are at baseline. This is what evolution built them to be, without any deliberate engineering. He paused and let that sink in. Now consider what happens when they learn to engineer it deliberately. Consider what happens when a species whose cells naturally prey on every other form of life discovers genetic modification and bioweapon development and targeted pathogenic warfare. They will not need warships to destroy us. They will need a cough. The Vreth delegation signaled agreement, and so did 3 other species representatives who had military traditions of their own and understood what Tessark was describing. The second faction was led by the Sonari High Crystal, a being called Illumin, who was the oldest individual in the chamber at nearly 900 years. Who spoke with the slow, careful precision of someone who had learned long ago that wisdom and speed rarely coexisted. Destruction would be premature and wasteful, Illumin said, and the light within their body moved in slow, thoughtful spirals. This species has survived a death world, not through brute strength or superior biology alone, but through an adaptability that is without precedent in our records. Their cells compete, and their bodies wage internal war, and yet they have built civilizations, developed art and language and philosophy, crossed the void between stars with technology that is crude by our standards, but functional nonetheless. Illumin turned to face Tessark directly. They have done all of this while carrying a war inside their own bodies that would have driven any other species to extinction. Does that not suggest a resilience worth studying rather than a threat worth destroying? I propose quarantine and long-term observation. We contain them. We study them. We learn what makes them function, and we use that knowledge to advance our own understanding of biology. The Sonari delegation and 2 other species signaled agreement. The third voice came from an unexpected source. In the far curve of the chamber, separated from the other delegations by a gap that was both physical and political, a small Aloth splinter mind called Tellerus pulsed with agitated light. Tellerus was not a senior representative, but was present as an observer with speaking rights. A position granted to independent Aloth minds that had separated from their parent collectives and operated as individual entities, something that most Aloth considered aberrant, and that most other species found deeply unsettling. "You are both wrong," Tellerus said, and its voice was sharper and more singular than Salith's harmonic tones, because it was one mind speaking with one voice, not many minds speaking as one. "You are looking at this data, seeing either a threat to be destroyed or a curiosity to be studied, and you are both missing the most important thing." Tellerus moved to the center of the chamber, flowing across the floor with a speed that drew attention. "We are losing," it said. The chamber went very quiet. "The Hollows," Tellerus continued, using the common name for the things that lived in the spaces between stars, the ancient, slow-moving entities that had been pressing against the boundaries of Concord space for millennia, consuming stations and ships and occasionally entire outposts with a patient, implacable hunger that no weapon in the Concord arsenal had been able to permanently stop. "The Hollows have taken 14 border systems in the last century. Our fleets slow them, but do not stop them. Our weapons damage them, but do not kill them. And every projection model we have shows them reaching the inner systems within 300 years. Tellerus pulsed with gold light. "Now we have found a species whose biology is designed from the cellular level up to fight and consume and adapt to any threat. A species that carries a war inside its body and wins that war every single day. A species whose immune system treats every new challenge as a puzzle to be solved and then weaponized. And you want to either destroy it or lock it in a cage." Tellerus turned to face the full council. "I say we ally with them. I say we give them a seat at this table and point them at the darkness and let them do what their biology has spent 4 billion years learning to do." The reaction was immediate and hostile. Tessark called the suggestion insane and pointed out that allying with humans was like domesticating a plague, and Illumin said that integration of an unclassified species into the Concord was without precedent and could not be considered without centuries of study and evaluation. Tellerus listened to all of it and said simply, "We do not have centuries." The debate lasted 14 hours. During those 14 hours on the Athenaeum, Ethan Mercer was not idle. He had been talking to his guards, a rotation of Wrath soldiers who stood outside his cell in shifts of 8 hours each, and most of them had refused to engage with him because they had been trained to treat specimens as objects, and objects did not require conversation. But one of them talked back. Her name was Shale, and she was young for a Wrath, which meant she was only about 60 years old, and she had not yet developed the rigid professional detachment that her older colleagues wore like armor. Ethan had started by asking simple questions: what the ship was called and where they were, and what the clicking sounds in the corridor meant. And Shale had answered, because she was curious too, and curiosity in the young is stronger than training. Over the hours, their conversations had grown longer and more complex. Learned enough of the Vreth language to supplement his translator's broken attempts, and Shale had learned enough about humans to begin questioning whether the terrifying biological data she had been briefed on told the whole story. "Your cells," she said during one of their conversations, standing on her side of the transparent wall and looking at him with her 4 amber eyes. They really fight each other? All the time, Ethan said. Does it hurt? Ethan thought about this. Not in a way we can feel. It is just background noise, like the sound of your own heartbeat. You stop noticing it. That does not make it less disturbing, Shale said. Ethan laughed, and it was a real laugh, warm and unguarded, and Shale found that she liked the sound of it, even though it was strange and alien to her. Let me tell you a story, Ethan said. Back on Earth we had animals called wolves, big predators with sharp teeth and strong jaws, and they hunted in packs. And they were very, very good at killing things. Shale listened. And humans feared them for thousands of years. We hunted them and trapped them and drove them away from our homes, and we almost wiped them out entirely. A logical response to a predator, Shale said. Sure, Ethan agreed. But then we did something that no logical species would ever do. We took the wolves and we brought them into our homes, and we fed them and we bred them, and over thousands of years we turned them into dogs. Loyal companions that slept at our feet and played with our children, and loved us with an intensity that is honestly kind of embarrassing. He leaned forward. We took the thing that could kill us, and we made it family. That is what we do, not because we are foolish, but because we understand something fundamental about the universe. Everything is dangerous. Everything can hurt you. The choice is not between safety and danger, because safety does not exist. It's between facing the danger alone and facing it with someone beside you. He looked at Shale through the transparent wall. Even if that someone has sharp teeth. Shale said nothing, but she did not look away. 14 hours after it began, the council vote was called. The Purifiers won. By a margin of 7-5, the council authorized the deployment of a sterilization fleet to the Sol system, with orders to neutralize the human species and render their worlds uninhabitable. Tellurus voted against, and when the result was announced, it said nothing, and showed no visible reaction, and quietly left the chamber. 4 hours later, a transmission was sent from an unregistered communication array on the outskirts of Concord space, aimed at the nearest known human colony. The signal was unencrypted and brief, and it contained a single word in rough human English. The sterilization fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system on a Tuesday, which was a detail that no alien species would consider meaningful, but which every human who survived that day would remember for the rest of their lives, because humans attach significance to time in ways that other species find baffling and yet undeniably effective. 200 warships arranged in the standard Concord assault formation, a layered geometric pattern designed over centuries to maximize overlapping fields of fire while minimizing vulnerability to counterattack, emerged from the bright wounds of their hyperspace exits and oriented themselves toward the small blue world that hung in the distance like a marble suspended in darkness. Fleet Commander Tessark stood on the bridge of the flagship Absolute Certainty and surveyed the system ahead and expected to find what the intelligence reports had described: a moderately developed species with limited orbital infrastructure and primitive faster-than-light capability and token military assets that would pose no meaningful resistance to a Concord battle fleet. What he found was a wall. It stretched across the approach vector to Earth in a formation so dense that his tactical display initially classified it as a debris field before the sensors corrected themselves. And the correction made Tessark's mandibles go rigid with something he had not felt in a very long time. There were thousands of them. Human ships, not beautiful and not elegant, built from heavy metals and blunt angles, with none of the flowing organic curves that characterized Concord vessel design. They looked like they had been hammered together by angry blacksmiths, and painted by children, and armed by people who believed that there was no such thing as too many guns. And they were arranged in a pattern that Tessark recognized. He recognized it because he had spent the last 3 days reviewing the biological data from the Athenaeum, and he had seen this exact formation before, not in any military textbook, but on a microscope slide. It was the pattern that human white blood cells formed when they surrounded a pathogen. The humans fought the same way at every scale. Tesark stared at the display, and he understood three things in rapid succession. First, the warning from Tellurus had reached them. Second, they had not run. Third, they had been ready for this possibility long before anyone had warned them. Because a species that carries war in its blood does not need to be told that war is coming. It can feel it the way it feels its own heartbeat, constant and certain and always present. The human fleet had been assembled in less than 72 hours, pulled together from dozens of colonies scattered across multiple star systems, civilian ships retrofitted with weapons, mining vessels with their drill arrays repurposed as cutting beams, transport ships loaded with explosive cargo, and crews who volunteered to fly them directly at the enemy. Tesark opened a communication channel to the human fleet, expecting to hear demands or threats, or perhaps a plea for negotiation. What he heard was music. Someone on the human side had broadcast a song across all frequencies, and it was loud and driving and aggressive, and Tesark did not understand the words, but he understood the tone, because the tone was universal. It was the sound of something that was not afraid. The first engagement lasted 11 minutes, and it was a disaster for the Concorde. Not because the human ships were more advanced, they were not. Concorde weapons had greater range, and greater precision, and greater destructive power by every measurable metric. Not because the humans had superior tactics. Their coordination was rough and improvisational, and lacked the mathematical precision of Concorde fleet doctrine. Because the humans fought wrong. They did not maintain formation. They broke apart and swarmed, individual ships making independent decisions at speeds that suggested either brilliant instinct or complete insanity. And Tesark suspected it was both. They did not respect range. They closed to point-blank distance, where their inferior weapons became devastating. Because at close range, precision mattered less than volume of fire, and the humans had a lot of guns. They did not retreat when damaged. Ships that were burning and venting atmosphere, and clearly dying, did not pull back to be repaired. They accelerated toward the nearest enemy vessel, and used their own destruction as a weapon. Tesark watched a human frigate, its hull cracked open, and its engines failing, turn directly into the path of a Concorde destroyer, and detonate its reactor core at contact range, taking the destroyer with it, and the tactical feed showed him that the frigate's crew had manually overridden every safety system to make this happen. They chose to die in order to kill. His tactical officer, a veteran of 40 years of Concorde military service, turned to him with an expression that Tesark had never seen on a Vreth face before. "They are not fighting us," the officer said. "They are feeding on us." And Tesark understood what he meant, because the human fleet was adapting in real time, each engagement teaching them something new about Concorde ship capabilities, and each lesson being applied immediately to the next attack. Just as their immune cells learned from each pathogen they consumed, and built new weapons from the knowledge. The Concorde fleet had trained for war against rational opponents who valued survival and calculated acceptable losses, and withdrew when the cost exceeded the benefit. The humans did not calculate. They fought the way their cells fought, with a totality of commitment that left no room for retreat and no consideration for self-preservation, and the ferocity of it was unlike anything the Concorde had ever faced. By the time Tesark ordered the fleet to regroup, the formation had already broken, and 17 ships were gone, and the human fleet was pressing forward, not waiting, not pausing, not giving him time to think, because humans understood instinctively that momentum was a weapon too. The battle lasted 4 hours in total. When it was over, 137 Concorde ships had been destroyed or disabled, and the remaining 63 were in full retreat, jumping to hyperspace in scattered desperate groups, abandoning formation and protocol in their haste to escape. The human fleet had lost nearly half its number. They did not seem to care. On the Athenium, which had been positioned well behind the battle line, Ethan Mercer watched the engagement on a screen that Shale had activated for him, because she had decided somewhere in the last 48 hours that keeping him in the dark was wrong, and that whatever was happening, he deserved to see it. He watched in silence. He did not cheer when the Concorde ships were destroyed, and he did not celebrate when the fleet retreated, and his face showed nothing that Shale could read as triumph or satisfaction. He looked tired. He looked like a man watching something inevitable happen and wishing it had not been necessary. When the last Concorde ship vanished into hyperspace, Eurelvan came to his cell. She stood on the other side of the transparent wall, and she was trembling, not with rage but with something more complicated, a mixture of fear and awe and the shattering of a worldview that had taken 400 years to build. "How?" she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "How can a species so young and so primitive do this?" Ethan stood and he walked to the wall, and he placed his hand flat against it and looked at her through the barrier, separated them, and for the first time since his capture, there was no humor in his eyes and no warmth in his voice. "You put our cells in a dish," he said, "and they fought each other, and you thought that made us broken. You thought it was a flaw, a deficiency, something that marked us as primitive and dangerous, and unworthy of a place among your civilized species." He leaned closer. "You did not understand. That is how we train. Every cell in our body has been at war since the day we were born. Not because we are flawed, but because our world taught us that peace is a luxury that must be earned through strength. Every generation of every cell line in our bodies has been tested and culled and hardened by a world that was trying to kill us from the moment life first sparked in the oceans." He pressed his hand harder against the wall. "You looked at us under a microscope, and you saw chaos. You should have seen an army that has been drilling for 4 billion years, an army that fights itself to stay sharp, because there is no opponent in the universe more dangerous than the enemy you carry in your own blood." He stepped back. "You voted to destroy us because you were afraid. I understand that. Fear is something we know very well. We carry it in every cell, just like we carry the war. But here is the thing about humans that your microscopes could not show you." He paused. "We fight. That is what we are. But we also choose, and the choice is always there, in every cell, and in every heart, and in every hand that reaches for a weapon or reaches for a friend." He looked at Shale, who stood behind Eurelvan in the corridor, and his expression softened. "We would rather reach for a friend." 6 months later, the Concorde opened diplomatic negotiations with the United Human Territories. The negotiations were held on neutral ground, a station that had been purpose-built in the empty space between human and Concorde territory, and they were mediated by Tellurus, who had been formally expelled from the Oluth Collective for sending the warning, and who did not seem to mind, because independence suited a mind like Tellurus better than consensus ever had. The terms were simple and direct, because humans preferred things that way, and the Concorde had learned very quickly that simplicity with humans was safer than complexity. Humanity would be granted full membership in the Concorde, with complete autonomy and equal representation, and the respect that they had earned through 4 billion years of cellular warfare and 4 hours of fleet combat. In exchange, when the Hollows finally came, and they would come, because the darkness between stars was patient but not infinite, and the things that lived there were already stirring with a hunger that had been building for eons, humanity would stand at the front. Not because they were expendable, because they were built for. Ethan Mercer, now bearing the title of ambassador, though he still thought of himself as a captain, stood on the observation deck of the diplomatic station, and watched the stars burn in the darkness, and beside him stood Shale, who had requested a transfer from the Athenaeum to the diplomatic corps, for reasons that she described as professional interest, and that everyone else recognized as something warmer and more complicated. "Do you ever wonder," Shale asked quietly, her 4 amber eyes reflecting the starlight. If your people will turn that aggression on us one day. Ethan was quiet for a long time, and the stars moved slowly past the window, and somewhere inside his body, trillions of cells fought their endless war. And somewhere outside the window, the darkness between stars was vast and deep, and full of things that were just beginning to realize they were no longer the most frightening thing in the galaxy. Every day, he admitted. Honest and bare. That is why we need you, all of you, not because we are weak, but because we are strong in a way that is dangerous without something to hold on to. You remind us to be more than what our blood tells us to be. Shale reached out with one long segmented arm and placed her hand next to his on the railing, and they stood there together in the light of 100 billion stars, the insect and the predator, the scientist's child and the soldier's son, 2 impossible creatures from 2 impossible worlds, finding in each other the one thing that evolution never planned for, a reason to stop fighting. And far away, in the cold dark spaces between the stars, where light had never reached and warmth had never existed, something ancient and vast and very, very old shifted in its endless sleep and opened senses that were not eyes, and felt something it had not felt in all the long eons of its existence. It felt the tremor of a species that fought itself to stay sharp. It felt the echo of 4 billion years of war compressed into a single genome. It felt the presence of something that did not fear the dark, because it had been born in a darkness of its own. The darkness inside a body where every cell was a soldier, and every heartbeat was a drum. And for the first time in its ancient and terrible existence, it felt afraid.